frame by frame. That's how the FIA spent the hours after Spa, slowing one of the fastest corners in Formula One into a sequence of frozen moments. At over 300 kilometers per hour, they watched a Ferrari drift wide under braking. They watched a Mercedes spin helplessly into the gravel. And frame by frame, they reached a verdict that should have ended the controversy. Instead, it created one. Because something didn't add up. The driver who caused the crash said it wasn't a penalty. The driver whose race was destroyed refused to blame him. Both team principals questioned the decision. Even one of Formula One's most respected broadcasters disagreed with the stewards. So here's the question that changed the entire weekend. If almost everyone involved thought the punishment was unnecessary, why did the FIA hand it out in the first place? The answer goes far beyond a single incident at Les Combes. It exposes a growing problem inside Formula One, one that could shape not only this championship, but the future of how the sport judges racing itself. It started as the weekend everyone expected. Spa-Francorchamps, a track built for legends, carried three storylines into the paddock. Antonelli on pole, Ferrari trying to close a power deficit that had defined its entire season, and Hamilton chasing his own history at the one circuit he's dominated for a decade. That history is not a small thing to chase. 6 poles, 5 wins. The 2020 lap record still standing under his name, untouched by every driver who has come through this sport since. At Spa, Hamilton isn't a challenger. He's the standard everyone else is measured against. The driver whose name has become synonymous with this stretch of Belgian forest long before anyone else on the current grid had even sat in a Formula One car. Every year the Paddock arrives here expecting him to remind everyone why. Engineers plan strategy around his pace through the middle sector. Rivals study his onboard laps looking for the one thing they're missing. Even the weather forecast becomes part of the story here, because a wet Spa has historically been where his advantage grows rather than shrinks. This year was supposed to be no different, a weekend where the record book and the reality on track finally lined up again. But none of that ended up being the story. One corner, one lap in, changed everything. The sequence that decided the weekend began, as it so often does at Spa, in the most dramatic stretch of track in Formula One. Eau Rouge, Rydillon. The climb, the compression, the blind crest that turns a straight into a leap of faith. The point on the map where drivers stop thinking and start trusting the car underneath them. Down the Kemmel Straight, Hamilton found the slipstream and the space to make his move, slingshotting past Russell with the kind of conviction that has defined his relationship with this circuit for nearly 20 years. For a moment, it looked like exactly the kind of overtake that fills highlight reels, clean, decisive, the sort of move that reminds people why this driver and this track have always belonged together. But the move wasn't finished. It carried into Les Combes, where two cars arrived at the same gap with neither driver willing to lift. The contact itself was small, almost invisible from the outside, but decisive. Russell's car snapped sideways, clipped the gravel trap, and the engine note that had been building through the S's went dead. Up ahead, oblivious, Hamilton drove on, completely unaware of the storm about to land on him. What the stewards produced afterward read less like a ruling and more like an argument with itself. They found that Russell was entitled to the space he had claimed. They found that Hamilton's front end had washed out under braking. And they found, almost in the same breath, that Hamilton appeared to be visibly trying to avoid the contact altogether. 3 findings, 3 different directions, and the penalty that followed matched the confusion. A verdict of wholly at fault was paired with a punishment cut in half, 0 penalty points added to his license, and the softest possible way to serve it, a virtual safety car period, timed so it cost him almost nothing. A driver ruled entirely responsible for taking out a title rival, and yet the paperwork barely left a mark on his afternoon. This was the moment doubt entered the story, a punishment that reads like even the judges weren't sure. If anyone had a right to be furious, it was the man sitting in the gravel. Instead, Russell's post-race reaction did the opposite of what the moment called for. He refused to blame Hamilton outright, describing the incident as a racing incident rather than a foul. And while he admitted Hamilton carried more of the responsibility, he was clear there was no recklessness behind it. There was no venom in it, no demand for justice. Just a driver stepping out of his car and choosing restraint at the exact moment restraint was the last thing anyone expected from him. What actually made him angry wasn't the contact at all. It was his own Mercedes losing power down the straight in the first place, the same deployment issue that had quietly shadowed his season long before Spa ever arrived on the calendar. And then came the line that landed harder than any steward's verdict could, Russell admitting he's become numb to disappointment. Not furious, not bitter, just exhausted. A title contender running out of ways to be surprised by his own car, describing his season in the language of resignation rather than fight. If Russell wasn't willing to point the finger, the rest of the paddock had no such hesitation, just not in the direction anyone expected. Fred Vasseur called the penalty mega harsh. Toto Wolff, the man whose own driver had been hit, defended the driver who caused it. Martin Brundle, a voice with decades of credibility behind it, said flatly he wouldn't have made that call. And Hamilton himself, the man actually holding the penalty, called it a non-penalty. For separate voices, for completely different vantage points inside this sport, and not one of them siding with the officials who made the decision. Stack those voices together and the irony becomes impossible to ignore. The culprit, the culprit's boss, the victim's boss, and a veteran broadcaster, all standing on the same side, against the officials who made the call. When literally everyone with skin in the game disagrees, who was the penalty actually for? To be fair to the stewards, not everyone saw it the same way. Broadcast analysis breaking down the same footage argued that Russell had done nothing wrong at all, that fault in Formula One doesn't require intent, and that a front-end washing out under braking is still, mechanically, the cause of a crash regardless of how hard the driver tried to prevent it. That's worth sitting with, because it clarifies what the real dispute actually is. Nobody denies Hamilton caused the contact. The argument is whether a first-lap racing incident at Spa deserved punishment at all. It's not a disagreement about facts. It's a disagreement about philosophy. How hard a governing body should come down on the kind of contact that has happened at Les Combes for as long as Formula One cars have raced through it. And how much weight intent should carry when the outcome on the stopwatch is identical either way. Every season produces at least one incident like this, and every season the argument resurfaces in almost exactly the same shape, because the regulations themselves have never fully settled it. That's part of what keeps this story alive well past the checkered flag. It isn't really about one weekend. It's about a rulebook that still hasn't decided what it wants to be. And then, less than an hour later, the same stewards had the chance to show which philosophy they actually believed in, and delivered something that made the whole story messier instead of clearer. A second Hamilton incident, this time in the pit lane, where his release clipped a mechanic during a stop. No penalty. Cleared entirely. Meanwhile, a separate tire paperwork breach earned Ferrari a fine to the team, not a penalty to the driver. Line the three outcomes up side by side and any theory of an FIA vendetta against Hamilton collapses immediately. Nobody targeting a driver hands him a complete pass an hour after punishing him for something else. But that leaves a harder question standing in its place. Not bias. Inconsistency. 3 incidents, 3 different standards, all decided by the same panel on the same afternoon, and no clear thread connecting how each one was judged. Step back from the penalty entirely, though, and Spa exposed something far more consequential for Ferrari's season than a few tenths lost to a steward's inquiry. Spa-Francorchamps is a power circuit, long straights, minimal downforce demand, the purest test of raw engine output on the calendar, and under the 2026 regulations, with their heavier reliance on electrical deployment, that made it the cruelest possible stage for Ferrari's weakness to show itself in front of the entire paddock. Through the middle sector, cars were running on combustion power alone, deployment exhausted, straight-line speed bleeding away in real time, while rivals sailed past with battery reserves still in hand. Verstappen summed it up in a single, brutal comparison. Formula 3 power, Formula 1 downforce. The numbers back him up. A corner speed deficit of roughly 35 kilometers per hour. A lap time loss of close to 3.7 seconds. And a growing chorus of drivers publicly criticizing the 2026 power unit rules that created the gap in the first place. A complaint no longer confined to one garage, but spreading across the grid as team after team feels the same squeeze in different proportions. Ferrari hasn't been sitting still while this deficit widened. 2 countermeasures have already made it onto the car. A rotating rear wing system nicknamed the Macarena, and a blown exhaust flap designed to claw back straight-line speed by managing airflow at the rear of the car. Both are reporting real gains, and both represent genuine engineering effort under enormous time pressure. But both are symptom management, not a cure. The actual fix, a redesigned turbo, is still weeks away from race trim, sitting on a bench in Maranello while the championship keeps moving without it. And the clock on these stopgap solutions is already ticking louder than Ferrari would like. Blown exhaust technology is banned from 2027 entirely, which means this window for creative workarounds is closing fast, whether the real fix arrives in time or not. When the dust actually settled at Spa, the results told their own story. Antonelli took the win. Leclerc kept himself in the fight at the front. Hamilton, penalty and all, salvaged a quiet fourth. But buried in the standings was the twist nobody saw coming. Despite the penalty, Hamilton leapfrogs Russell in the championship, the victim of the entire saga now trailing the man who hit him. It's the kind of detail that only becomes visible once the emotion of race day fades and the numbers are left to speak for themselves, stripped of every argument that filled the paddock hours earlier. Zoom out to the constructors' table, and the picture sharpens further. Ferrari gained only a handful of points despite Mercedes' disastrous weekend, and that's the real signal. This is a pace problem, not a luck problem. A healthy Ferrari should have punished a wounded Mercedes far more severely than the scoreboard shows, and the fact that it didn't says more about Maranello's current form than anything written in the steward's report. It's a quiet kind of evidence, easy to miss in a weekend dominated by penalty talk, but it may end up mattering more to the championship than anything the stewards decided. Which leaves the bigger question hanging over everything that happened at Spa. Not who was right, not who was to blame, but whether the sport can trust the process that's supposed to settle these arguments once and for all. This was never really a story about villains. It's a story about consistency, and what happens next time two cars touch at turn one if the precedent set here is this shaky. Tie it back to where this all began. A verdict that argued with itself, a victim who refused to blame the man who hit him, and a paddock that walked away from Belgium more divided than when it arrived. Hamilton leaves Spa sitting second in the standings, but somehow further from the title than the record book says he should be. A driver who owns this circuit walking away from it under a cloud, with the actual fix for his car still sitting on a bench back in Maranello. The emotional note here isn't outrage. It's uncertainty. Nobody, not even the people who made the call, seems fully sure the FIA got this right. Zandvoort is next, and that's where we find out whether Ferrari's turbo upgrade finally closes the gap, or whether Spa was the day this title fight quietly slipped away. If you want to be there when that story unfolds, subscribe now so you don't miss it.